Just curious. What device are you watching on? Phone, TV, laptop? Comment below.
I've always known that my brother could get away with murder, and I mean that less as a metaphor and more as a quiet, uncomfortable suspicion that somewhere along the way, Jake crossed a line no one dared name. You don't grow up with a brother like mine and come out believing in fairness or consequences. You come out learning to keep your eyes open and your mouth shut. Because speaking up in our house was like lighting a match in a gas-soaked room, explosive, messy, and guaranteed to end with you being blamed for the fire. The day of the engagement party felt like one long rehearsal for pretending. Our mom had sent out embossed invitations to nearly 100 people, rented a country club with floor-to-ceiling windows, and insisted on a color scheme like she was planning a wedding for British royalty, not her emotionally stunted son and his too quiet fiancé. She told me just hours before the event, while we were all getting ready in the bridal suite, "Laura, I need you to be supportive today. Don't ruin this. Whatever you're feeling, keep it to yourself." And the way she said it, eyes narrowed, voice dipped in that syrupy tone that only she could make feel like a threat. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Jake was always the star of the show, even when the show was falling apart behind the curtain. When he walked into a room, people turned, smiled, leaned in like he was some kind of local celebrity. He'd gotten the charm, the looks, the job with 6 figures, and a corner office downtown, while I'd gotten the role of the bitter sister with too much time on her hands and a memory like a steel trap. That's what our mother used to say when I brought up the past. "Laura, you need to let things go. Not everything is a conspiracy, but sometimes things stick, not because you want them to, but because they're never really over." At the party, everyone played their parts. Jake shook hands with family friends who used to pinch our cheeks when we were kids, laughed loudly at jokes he didn't even listen to, and kissed Emily's cheek like he was doing her a favor. She looked beautiful, I'll give her that. Soft ivory dress, pearls, the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. She moved like someone used to tiptoeing. I watched her that whole night the way a hawk watches a mouse it's not quite ready to pounce on. Something about her didn't sit right, but not in the way everyone thought. It wasn't that she didn't fit. It was that she didn't belong in his life. She was too quiet, too observant, too strategic, and that told me she was playing a long game. Halfway through the night, as the waiters passed around champagne and the string quartet switched from Bach to some pop song turned classical, I caught my mother's eye from across the room. She mouthed something, probably a reminder to behave, and I turned away before the bile could reach my throat. That's when Emily stood up. At first, I didn't even notice. She wasn't loud or dramatic. She just moved, like a shadow slipping between the cracks of a room too full of noise. She held something in her hand, a folder, plain, manila, the kind you see in every office and never think twice about. She stood behind her chair, both hands gripping the folder tight like it was the only thing keeping her steady. Then, in a voice just loud enough to hush the nearby tables, she said, "Before we go any further tonight, I want to share something Jake hoped you'd never see. Now, let me stop here and ask you something, just so you can sit with it. If someone stood up at a party you were at, hell, at your sibling's engagement party, and said those words, what would you do? Would you get up and try to stop them? Would you laugh it off and assume it's some awkward joke? Or would you, like me, suddenly feel the cold slap of inevitability? The sick thrill of knowing deep down that this moment had been coming for a long, long time. The room froze. Conversations cut off mid-laugh. My mother's face turned the color of stale bread. Jake's smile faltered. Not collapsed, not crumbled, just flickered, the way power does when a storm's rolling in. He said her name once, sharp and low, Emily. But she didn't sit down. She didn't even blink. Then she turned, walked the folder across the room, and stopped in front of me. Not him. Me. She looked me in the eye. God, I will never forget that look. And held it out. "You should be the one to open it," she said. My fingers didn't hesitate. They moved before my brain could even process what was happening, like they'd been waiting years for this. The folder opened with a soft snap. Inside saw pages, some printed, some handwritten, one with a signature I recognized instantly. There were photos too, a few emails, one page that looked like a legal document. I didn't understand it all right away, but I saw enough to feel my stomach twist in a way I hadn't felt since high school, enough to understand, without needing to read a single word out loud, that this party was about to blow wide open. I looked up. My mother's mouth was parted in a silent gasp. My father had gone still, like someone hit pause on his body. Jake took a step forward, but Emily's hand lifted slightly, stopping him cold. And then I asked the question I didn't know was sitting in my throat until it came out. Is this why Sophie disappeared? Emily's answer was just a small, quiet nod. And just like that, everything started to fall apart. There was a peculiar kind of silence in the room, the kind that doesn't announce itself with quiet, but rather with stillness, like the air had thickened into something more solid and suffocating, as if the very molecules inside that white-walled banquet hall had realized, along with the rest of us, that nothing would be the same after this moment. I remember staring at the folder in my hands, feeling the weight of it like it was made of bricks instead of paper, and suddenly becoming hyper-aware of every eye in the room turning toward me. Not Jake, not Emily, but me. As though, by being the one now holding the truth, I'd somehow become responsible for it. The pages were cool and crisp, printed on standard white copy paper, but their content hit with the force of a sledgehammer. There was no theatrical reveal, no shouting, no dramatic music like in the movies. Just cold, undeniable facts laid out in black and white. The first few pages were emails, ordinary at first glance, subject lines like following up or re-our agreement. But the contents were anything but. Jake's voice in the emails was unmistakable, slick, manipulative, and disturbingly familiar. The same tone he used on clients, on girlfriends, on our mother when he wanted to twist a situation in his favor. He was careful with words but careless with power, and it showed. One email thread stood out immediately. It was dated just a few weeks after his college graduation and addressed to someone named Sophie M. My fingers clenched slightly. Sophie, a name that hadn't been spoken in our family for over a decade, a name that had been buried under layers of silence and denial. I remembered her well, too well. The sweet, quiet girl Jake had dated in high school, the one who used to bring him home-baked cookies and sat through his football games, rain or shine. She was the first girl he ever brought home, the first girl our mother had ever accepted. And then one day, without explanation, she vanished like a ghost. The email was blunt. It read in essence like a negotiation. Jake offered money, real money, not pocket change, in exchange for Sophie's silence about what had happened between them. He referenced an incident, something she had mentioned to a counselor, and stated in nauseatingly polite terms that he hoped she'd see the wisdom in letting the past rest in peace. Attached to that email was a scan of a non-disclosure agreement, complete with a signature at the bottom, Sophie M. Carlson. But that wasn't all. There were medical records, nothing too graphic, but enough to make your skin crawl. One report detailed a hospital visit, dated during their senior year of high school, listing emotional distress and physical bruising with a note about a possible domestic incident, flagged but never investigated further. Then came a letter, handwritten, tear-streaked, scanned into a PDF. Sophie had written it to herself, or maybe to someone she hoped would read it someday. In it, she detailed how Jake's charm was a mask, how he could turn cold in a heartbeat, how he had manipulated her, isolated her, and, in one incident she only hinted at, hurt her in a way she didn't have the courage to name. I felt the bile rise in my throat, not from shock, because deep down, none of this surprised me, but from confirmation. You can spend years gaslighting yourself, telling yourself maybe you misunderstood the way he looked at people, maybe you exaggerated the fear in your stomach when he got angry, maybe you were just bitter and jealous. And then one day, someone hands you a folder that says, "No, you were right." And suddenly you don't feel vindicated, you feel sick. Jake was still standing across the room, stiff as a statue, eyes darting between me and Emily, his mouth slightly open like he couldn't quite decide whether to argue, charm, or threaten. My mother looked like she might faint. She had sunk into one of the white padded chairs at the table, one hand pressed to her chest like she was struggling to breathe, but her eyes never left the folder, wide and horrified, and most tellingly, not confused. Not once did she ask, "What is that?" or "What are you talking about?" She knew, maybe not the whole of it, but enough. And Emily just stood there, serene, collected, like a storm had passed through her long ago and she'd already done the grieving. There was a strength in her posture I hadn't noticed before, the kind of strength that doesn't shout, doesn't argue, but waits, quietly, confidently, because it already knows how the story ends. Jake finally moved, breaking the spell. He walked toward me, slow, measured steps, the kind he used when he was trying to reassert control. "Laura," he said, voice low and velvety, the kind he reserved for courtrooms and confessionals. "You don't understand what you're looking at. It's not what you think." But before I could respond, before I could even decide whether I wanted to scream or laugh or punch him square in the teeth, Emily turned to him, calm as ever, and said, "Don't, just don't." Her voice wasn't angry, it was disappointed, and that somehow cut deeper. Then she turned back to me, her expression softening. "There's more," she said, and reached into her small white clutch purse, pulling out a second envelope, thinner, labeled simply "backup." She handed it to me with a whisper, "In case he tries to deny anything." And still, even then, even with all that evidence and all that hurt laid out in front of us like a crime scene photo, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not rage, not justice, but dread. Because now I had a choice, and whatever I chose next would tear our family apart. There's a particular type of memory that doesn't fade with time, one that doesn't lose color or edges or sting, memories that, even after years of being shoved into mental drawers and buried beneath new seasons of your life, still know how to crawl out in the dark, uninvited and fully intact. And as I sat there in that ridiculous country club, staring at Emily's calm face and the second envelope she had just placed into my trembling hands, I felt that kind of memory rise from the grave, not because I wanted it, not because I was ready, but because some ghosts don't knock before they enter. Sophie had always been the girl who didn't belong in our world, and yet for a brief time she'd been everywhere, her soft laugh floating through our hallways, her hand folded inside Jake's like she actually believed he was safe to hold, her eyes lighting up at the smallest gestures. She was gentle in a way that made you protective of her, and yet, in the twisted power dynamics of our home, that gentleness became a liability. She wasn't built for people like my brother. She wasn't built for our mother's cold warmth or my father's silence, for the unspoken rule that everything was fine as long as it looked fine. And when she disappeared from our lives, she didn't do it with screams or drama. She vanished quietly, like a curtain being drawn over a scene no one wanted to remember. I was 18 when Sophie stopped showing up, and I remember the moment as vividly as I remember the look in Emily's eyes now. It was early summer, and Jake had come home from college for a weekend, acting strange, jumpy, irritable, snapping at everyone, even Mom. He'd locked himself in his room, and the next day, we were told not to mention Sophie anymore. Just like that. No explanation, no goodbye, no closure. When I asked what happened, Mom said she was unstable, that she'd made things up, that Jake was lucky to be rid of her, and we were all better off letting that chapter go. And I did let it go, or I thought I did, because back then, I didn't have the power to dig deeper, and I sure as hell didn't have allies. I only had my instincts, and in our family, instinct was always the first thing to be doubted. But now Emily was rewriting that chapter right in front of me, and I wasn't sure whether I felt relief or guilt. Probably both, maybe more. She leaned in slightly, not whispering, but not loud enough for anyone else to hear, and said, "Sophie never wanted to disappear. She just didn't have a choice. She was cornered, humiliated, paid off. And when she tried to speak out, your mom convinced her that no one would believe her. And honestly, she was right. The weight of those words didn't fall slowly, it crashed. I looked over at my mother, still sitting in that stiff white chair, clutching the stem of her champagne flute like it was the last piece of structure she had left. Her face, pale and stretched, wasn't the face of someone shocked by revelation. It was the face of someone watching her lies unravel in real time, strand by strand, unable to stop the process, but too proud to confess. And suddenly I saw everything I had missed. Or maybe everything I hadn't allowed myself to believe back then. I remembered the late-night calls between Mom and Jake after Sophie left, the sudden arrival of a new girl a few weeks later, the way my mother cooed over her like she'd been handpicked by angels, calling her a much better fit. I remembered my own confusion, how I had quietly asked, just once, what happened with Sophie, and been met with a cold look and a quiet warning. We don't discuss people who try to hurt this family. Emily sat down beside me now, her calm demeanor still intact, her voice steady and surgical. Sophie and I met by accident, she said. I didn't go looking for her. She found me. She reached out after seeing an article about Jake and me online. Said she recognized the same patterns in me that she saw in herself. The same look in the eyes. The same way we stood too close to exits. The same smile that never touched the pupils. I felt my breath catch. Emily was right. I had seen those signs too. I just hadn't named them. Maybe because I was too scared. Or maybe because I thought it wasn't my place. That's what our mother drilled into us. Not your place, Laura. Not your concern. You don't know the whole story. But maybe the truth was I had known enough. I just hadn't trusted myself. Emily continued, her words now sharper, more deliberate. We've been in touch for months, planning this, collecting everything. I didn't want revenge at first. I just wanted the truth. But when I realized how deep it went, when I saw the emails, the money transfers, the legal threats, something changed. I realized silence would just let it happen again. Maybe to someone else. Maybe to me. The bravery in her was terrifying. Not because it was loud or angry, but because it was composed, dangerous, rooted in a kind of pain that had fermented into precision. And for the first time that night, I stopped seeing her as Jake's fiancée and started seeing her as someone like me, someone who had learned to sit with discomfort for so long, it had become second nature to keep smiling through it. Then she leaned even closer and whispered, "But it's not just about Sophie. Your mother knew. She helped him, protected him. You need to know that." The room around us was buzzing again, confused murmurs, uncomfortable glances, people pretending not to look, but failing miserably. Jake was pacing now, tugging at his cufflinks like he was trying to rip them off, like he could undo what was happening if he just twisted hard enough. My father was still frozen, watching everything with that dull-eyed silence that had become his signature over the years. And my mother, oh my mother, was still pretending none of this was real, holding her glass, avoiding my eyes, clinging to the last illusion of control like a lifeboat in a storm. Emily looked at me one last time, her voice low but steady. "You know what kind of man he is. You've always known. You were just waiting for someone else to say it." And she was right. The ghost of Sophie Carlson wasn't haunting this party because she wanted revenge or pity. She was here because the truth, when buried long enough, stops being a secret and becomes a sickness, one that poisons everyone who touches it. And suddenly I realized I didn't want justice. I wanted an autopsy. There comes a moment in every family's history when the carefully stacked cards that built the illusion of unity finally collapse. Not because someone shouted or slammed a door or walked out in a fit of rage, but because the truth, when spoken softly and clearly, slices far deeper than any scream ever could. And as I sat in that room, still holding the folder and the second envelope Emily had slipped into my hands like a detonator wired to everything we thought we were, I realized that the silence around me had shifted from stunned disbelief to something far more dangerous, recognition. My mother, always so polished, so calculated, the woman who had never once left the house without mascara or a matching pair of shoes, now looked like she was fighting to hold her skin in place, as though the scaffolding of her control had finally cracked and the version of herself she'd spent a lifetime curating was trying to flee her body. Her eyes flicked to mine with a look that wasn't confusion or even denial. It was warning. The same warning I'd grown up seeing every time I got too close to something she didn't want exposed. The same look she gave me when I asked, at 15, why Dad never stood up for me when Jake mocked me in front of guests. The same look she gave me when I asked at 19 why she'd bailed Jake out of a situation with a girl from his dorm and told me to mind my own future. I'd always known she was complicit in something, but I hadn't understood the scale of it until that night, until that moment, until Emily's calm, quiet confession had pierced the membrane we'd all agreed to pretend was unbreakable. Jake, pacing now like a lion trapped in a zoo enclosure, had the look of someone who wasn't used to losing control of the narrative. His entire life had been built on charm, on smiling through tension, on turning every accusation into a misunderstanding or a miscommunication, and for years it had worked. Not because he was a genius, but because no one ever stayed in the room long enough to force him to answer real questions. And our mother had been his greatest enabler, his mirror and his shield, always a few steps ahead, always ready to smooth the wrinkles and dismiss the witnesses with just enough passive-aggressive grace to keep the illusion intact. I turned to her then, no longer interested in subtlety or diplomacy or the dance we'd been doing since childhood, and asked a question I already knew the answer to. How long have you known? She didn't flinch. That was the most terrifying part. She didn't even blink. Her lips tightened, her hands folded in her lap, and she said in that measured voice she used when she wanted to sound composed and maternal, "You don't understand how complicated things were back then." That sentence, back then, clung to the walls like smoke. I laughed, not because anything was funny, but because the absurdity of her still trying to frame this as some kind of ancient misunderstanding, rather than an ongoing cover-up, was almost too grotesque to process. "Complicated?" I asked, my voice shaking, not with fear, but fury. "He coerced a girl into silence. You paid her off. You signed papers. This wasn't complicated, Mom. It was calculated." She finally looked at me, and for a brief second, the mask slipped. "He was 17, she said, as if that single number erased everything that had come after. "He was a child. He made a mistake. And if we hadn't stepped in, his entire future would have been destroyed." And there it was, the confession, not shouted, not dragged out with accusations or forced through sobs, just stated plainly like it was a simple fact, a strategic move in a game she had always believed she was playing better than anyone else. I felt something in me harden in that moment, some final thread snapping loose from the idea that she had ever cared about right and wrong, about protecting the innocent, about anything other than the appearance of order. She hadn't saved Jake from ruin. She had saved herself from the embarrassment of having her perfect son, her golden boy, her pride and proof of motherhood, exposed for what he really was. Aunt Rita, who had been unusually quiet all evening, sitting 2 tables away with her wine glass refilled more than once, stood up now and made her way over. She was my mother's older sister, a woman who had never quite fit the mold, who smoked in secret at family weddings and once called Jake a spoiled little prince, loud enough for half the cousins to hear. She'd always been a little too real for my mother's taste. And now, as she placed a hand gently on the back of my chair, I saw that familiar fire in her eyes. "You think this is new?" she asked, voice low but steady. I warned her. 20 years ago, I told her what I saw. That boy has always known how to twist people into giving him exactly what he wants. And Carol, she said, turning now to my mother, whose face tightened at the sound of her name, you let him believe he was untouchable." My mother tried to stand but stopped halfway, realizing too late that the room was watching, the guests frozen in various degrees of discomfort, caught between the performance of etiquette and the undeniable pull of real drama unraveling in front of them. Jake was no longer pacing. He was seated again, staring down at the tablecloth like it held answers, or maybe just because he couldn't bear to look anyone in the eye. Emily, composed as ever, reached into her clutch again. God, that purse of hers felt like a magician's hat, and slid a small stack of papers across the table toward me. This, she said, is the rest of it. Bank statements, work emails, copies of complaints filed by interns he fired before they could escalate. It's not just about Sophie, it's a pattern, and it's dangerous. My hands trembled as I picked them up, not from fear, but from the sheer gravity of what I was now holding. With this, I could destroy him, his job, his reputation, maybe even his freedom. But in doing so, I'd burn the entire family to the ground. Not just Jake, my mother, my father, even myself. Because once you become part of the truth, you don't get to stay clean. You either stay silent and complicit, or you speak and accept the collateral damage. Emily leaned in closer, her voice nearly a whisper. I'm not asking you to make it public. I'm asking you to decide what kind of silence you want to live with. And there it was, my line in the sand, not drawn by someone else, not inherited, not pushed upon me, mine, chosen. And as I sat there, holding the sins of our family in one hand and the future of our story in the other, I realized that revenge wasn't the hard part. It was deciding what kind of legacy I was willing to leave behind. It's strange how the world doesn't end with sirens or flames or screaming. Sometimes it ends in a slow, breathless unraveling where every polite smile is weaponized, every gesture is a trap door, and the clinking of crystal glasses sounds more like nails into a coffin than celebration. And as I stood there in the hollow aftermath of Emily's revelation, with the truth laid bare and every single person in that room, now either avoiding eye contact or trying to silently align themselves with whichever side they thought would survive the fallout, I realized that something irreversible had already happened, and no matter what I said next, there would be no going back to the illusion we'd all lived inside for so long. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that sets in when you've been carrying the weight of other people's lies for years, an exhaustion that seeps into your bones, that makes your own reflection feel like a stranger's, that blurs the line between being complicit and just being too tired to keep fighting the tide. I'd spent years walking the tightrope between silence and self-respect, choosing family over truth, peace over confrontation, telling myself that it wasn't my place, that someone else would speak up, that if I just endured a little longer, maybe things would fix themselves. But things don't fix themselves, people don't change because you hope they will, and monsters don't stop feeding just because you close your eyes. So when I picked up my glass and rose from my seat, every breath in the room seemed to freeze midair. And though I wasn't sure what I was about to say until the words left my mouth, I knew the tone it needed to carry. It had to be calm, measured, surgical, the kind of truth that cuts without blood, that burns without smoke, the kind that forces even the most loyal liars to sit up and listen. I'd like to make a toast, I said, and the room fell quiet in a way that didn't feel celebratory. It felt clinical, like the hush before a verdict, like the world was waiting to see whether I'd pull the trigger or put the gun down. I looked at Jake first, not out of cruelty, not to shame him, but because I needed him to see that I was no longer afraid of what he'd do if I spoke out. His face was unreadable now, the smirk gone, the charm drained, as if he finally understood that no amount of charisma could smooth over the rot that had been exposed. Then I looked at my mother, who still sat rigid in her chair, lips pressed so tightly together they had turned white, her hands folded so neatly they looked like they belonged to a porcelain figurine and not a living woman. She hadn't tried to speak since the confrontation, hadn't offered excuses or defenses or tears. Just that same brittle silence she'd mastered over the years, the silence that had protected him, preserved the lie, punished the truth. I've always thought that family meant protecting one another, I began. letting the weight of each word land with purpose. That it meant sacrifice, loyalty, love. But what no one tells you is that sometimes protecting someone means letting them face the consequences they've spent their lives running from. And sometimes loyalty looks a lot like complicity. And sometimes love becomes a weapon when it's used to silence pain. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at their plates, while a handful leaned in, riveted, as if this were some unscripted finale to a show they didn't know they'd been cast in. Emily watched me with calm support. Not pushing, not pleading, just watching, letting me lead now, as if she knew I had to be the one to swing the hammer if the house was ever going to fall. "I'm not going to tell you everything I've learned tonight," I continued, my voice steady, my grip on the glass firm but not trembling. Not because I want to protect anyone, but because some truths don't need to be shouted to be heard. Some truths are louder in silence. But I will say this, when a man builds his life on secrets, eventually the cracks show, and when they do, the people who helped him hide those secrets don't get to act surprised. I saw my father lower his head, his hands clasped on the table like he was praying, though I'd never once seen him pray in my life. I saw Aunt Rita nod slowly, approvingly, her arms crossed, eyes sharp, and I saw Jake's expression flicker, just once, a quick flash of something, maybe fear, maybe shame, maybe just the dawning realization that he was no longer untouchable. "I raise this glass," I said, lifting it slightly. "Not to the couple, not to the future, but to the truth. Whatever it costs, whoever it burns, however long it's been buried. Because tonight, finally, it's free." There was no applause, no chorus of agreement, just silence. The sound of glass being set down on linen, the sound of walls breaking quietly, the sound of endings. Emily stood next, not to speak, but to leave. She picked up her clutch, the one that had contained all those secrets like a loaded weapon, and gave me a faint nod. She didn't need to say anything. She'd already said enough. She walked out of the banquet hall, heels clicking with purpose, and though no one followed her, no one stopped her either. Jake stayed seated. He didn't try to save face, didn't chase after her. Maybe he finally realized there was no act left to perform. My mother turned her gaze toward me once more, and this time there was something brittle in her eyes. Not hate, not rage, but a deep aching disappointment, as if I had betrayed the script she'd written in her mind for our lives. And in that moment, I realized she wasn't grieving for Jake. She was grieving for the illusion. I sat down, heart still pounding, unsure whether what I'd done was brave or cruel, righteous or petty, but knowing deep in my gut that it was necessary, because someone had to be the first to stop pretending. Someone had to say that love, without truth, isn't love at all. Later that night, long after the tables had been cleared and the guests had awkwardly scattered into the night, I sat in my car with the second envelope still unopened on the passenger seat. I hadn't given it to the press. I hadn't forwarded it to HR. I hadn't decided yet what the final blow should be. Because revenge, I was learning, wasn't always about destruction. It was about choice, about what you build from the ashes. And as I watched the lights of the country club flicker off behind me, I knew the story wasn't over. It was just no longer being told by liars.